Welcome back, folks, to episode 7 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills and Self-Improvement Project podcast. With your host, me, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, and also licensed professional counselor and adjunct professor at a local community college. And what I want to do today, we're going to be covering assumption of safety. This is what I've been promising the first 5 episodes that I would do, but I've had to kind of lead in a little bit with some background. And the first 5 episodes of this podcast, even though they don't need to be consumed in order, will actually create a bit of foundation for what the assumption of safety is. Whenever we are discussing about somebody being in stress, somebody living their lives normally, going to the grocery store, or being with family at home or out and about in public, there is this generally assumed sense of security and safety that we have, and this is what we'll be discussing today. And the reason assumption of safety as a term, and I've coined the term assumption of safety, because it's a dynamic, useful term when we're discussing the social value of certain behaviors, but also psychologically what it is that we're thinking whenever we're doing our day-to-day tasks at the higher cognitive prefrontal cortical level of processing without assuming that there's going to be any particular danger. Now, this is qualifiable, but this is a very useful working term that I'll be referring to with great regularity because it will give you the gist of what it is that may be occurring whenever things fall apart, when things get stressful, when they get difficult, even when they get really, really fun. We may not pay attention to the potential for risk, threat, danger, this sort of thing. And often those are things that are put aside or in the back of our mind whenever we're in the process of doing our lives, jumping in the bouncy house, running out on the trail all by yourself, or maybe even you're out in public, shopping at the grocery store, surrounded by people, all of them strangers it would seem, and yet feeling comfy. And those things are okay. I'm not here to take a negative tone about things, but it's always good to be able to be aware, self-aware of what's going on inside of my internal environment, inside of my body, from the skin in, and also what's going on from the skin out in my immediate environment that I'm interacting with. And this is what is often called being self-aware, but also when it's on the outside of me and how I'm interacting, often it is called situational awareness. And this is a term that is frequently used by people that train folks in police, law enforcement, even whenever someone is learning self-defense, being aware of a situation. That tends to pare things down and makes it a very antiseptic term in my way of looking at things because one's attention is always on. And one should be attentive, but one shouldn't have to pay attention. One never really does. These are more scholastic educational terms to give somebody a sense of what they're wanting them to do. You should pay more attention, for instance, in quotes. And our attentive quality is always on by way of our perception through our ears, our eyes, our nose, mouth, and skin, this sort of thing, through our 5 senses. And the general wherewithal that we get from those things moment to moment are what we call awareness. And then whatever our body's doing on the inside, called proprioception, has to do with how we interact with space, whether we're upright, upside down, or flying sideways through space, which all of that sounds rather interesting. But those are the things that signal us whether or not we're in a relatively normal state of business for the most part, like we do day to day. So assumption of safety. Why is this so important? I would like you to think with me about what safety means first off, and also what security means, and expectations, and then after that, prediction. So let's start off with safety first. Safety is essentially has to do with how secure you feel, how safe something is, has to do with whether or not it can cause you harm, whether or not I feel there is harm to me. But the next statement, security, ties right into it, has to do with a sense of belief or faith in the fact that things aren't necessarily going to harm you or hurt you. And there's a general sense of, here's the next term, predictability and prediction and expectation. Expectation came first and prediction, the way I said it earlier. And it's not necessarily a progression um, that is in a certain order, but rather the terms I want you to pay attention to. I expect things to be a certain way. And that gives me a sense of safety and security, but also predictability. All these terms work really well together, and they're tied very closely together to what we call situational awareness. So, what does this have to do with assumption of safety? Whenever we use the term assumption, there is an idea there that we expect, and it's relatively predictable, it would seem, in my world, that things will work out a certain way, and that gives me a sense of security and expectation, and therefore predictability. This will happen again in my world, and those things are comforting to us. An assumption of safety is a good thing to have. So when an assumption of safety is met, that means my assumption of safety, security, expectation, predictability of a certain place that I'm at, even if it's somewhere that I just walked up to, um, it's a false sense of security in the sense that it's transient and it could very quickly change and go away. And we kind of know this in the back of our mind going somewhere, but often we don't expect it to happen to me, it in quotes, or things to suddenly go bad or violent or turn sideways or go bad. We don't go into situations hoping for that, expecting that, or even possibly predicting it. But whenever we get too comfortable with our sense of safety, as if something hasn't happened ever to anyone like myself, and I'm not somehow potentially a good target or a victim, then I have set myself up to be vulnerable. So, an assumption of safety is a comforting mind state that is not bad to have, but I will tell you that if you've never gone through an event that was potentially dangerous, frightening, threatening, or traumatic, then this assumption of safety tends to be rather strong sometimes. And often we may be looking at things through rose colored glasses, as it were. Now, whenever we're young, we're naive, and we have parents to teach us that, assuming we have a regular, normal parenting situation going on, or hopefully somebody's teaching you that, so that you don't run into things headlong and head first painfully into experience, which experience is a wonderful teacher, but often a rough one. And this is where having mentors and teachers and parents are really helpful in cutting down the learning curve by showing people how to avoid pain or painful circumstance. So why is this important? If you've ever been in a situation that seems normal and all of a sudden goes bad, often we might have bad feelings that come up. And these bad feelings are a result of an increase in arousal, vigilance, hypervigilance, or what we would call our fight-flight response. And when we get there, often we'll feel almost betrayed by the environment, maybe, or the people that have been there, or maybe going somewhere, then someone acts a fool of whom you didn't expect to respond a certain way, and then you have to rethink who your friends are and whether or not you want to go out and have ice cream or whatever it is you might do with them. So the assumption of safety, this is a very critical point, is one that whenever we have gone through situations, we tend to be very cognizant of, we think about it, but we're also very wary of the fact that things could go awry rather quickly, almost like we're waiting for the other true shoe to drop. And that is something akin to being anxious and half expecting and relatively expectantly predicting things to go bad at some point. The idea is not to be there when it does. So we start looking for patterns. We're a pattern seeking organism. We as humans, we seek patterns. Once we see something and learn something, we tend to keep it close to ourselves, especially if it increases our chances of finding where the ice cream's at, getting good payoff and a little bit of dopamine that says, hey, you live, therefore you thrive and you win. You've got ice cream. But also, whenever we have survived a situation, and yes, we are going to the survival term here in a little bit, and while we use that as bottom line measurement, um, we have to be aware of those things that could go bad, that could cause us harm, so we can avoid them. This is the expectation prediction aspect of the terms we used earlier. So, why is this important? Once again, the assumption of safety. We never truly ever assume with any great deal of faith or any great deal of weight that things will just continue on and be fun. Now, can they? And can things turn out fine and they're not a tiger jump out and start eating people at the wedding or the party after the wedding or whatever? Yes. And things may go well. But whenever we have experienced stressors and we're anxious or are particularly sensitive to motion and loud noises or don't like being around crowds, that means our ability to respond has been narrowed. We're not nearly as flexible in response as we should be. Should be not because Armando says, but rather because whenever we're at our most flexible in response, we're also at our most creative and able to avert circumstances and consequences because we can read them more easily. We lose some sensitivity in being able to read body language, which is the first language that we learn to interpret, especially if we've been in stressful situations. And those are the things that we use as our measurement against what is normal behavior, especially if within the normal behavior we see things that are analogous or similar to the behaviors and the sounds, the tones, and the facial expressions or the twitchy movement all of a sudden that reminds us of when things weren't so good. So these can be the beginnings of post-traumatic stress reactivity. They can be the beginnings of anxiety and panic in some people. So these memories are patterns that we remember that help us predict, once again, and expect once we see things that are similar. And it's kind of hard to derail whenever it's taken off and it happens too quickly and too suddenly, especially if it's a presentation that's a little faster than 100 milliseconds. Because if it is faster than that, we will by default interpret it as a negative if we're seeing something presented in our external environment. This isn't even counting, well, what if I'm remembering negative stuff, which we'll discuss here momentarily. So when we have an assumption of safety met, that means my general sense of stress and anxiety will be lower. I'll feel a sense of safety and security, and I'm more apt to be able to interact and smile and enjoy and do the friend and befriend behaviors that we often see. We may even be able to have that oxytocin bonding, like when we hold baby or the cute little puppy and kitty, when we hold them and squeeze them really warmly and say, "Aw." Whenever we experience that, our assumptions of safety have been met. Now, that met does not mean as an absolute met forever on and hold your peace. It just means at that point, your sense of safety is good. But we have to remember that when our assumptions of safety are being met, that they are transient. They will come and they will go at some point. Just like a breath that comes in and leaves our body, it's temporary. Now, we can have a length of temporary assumption of safety, and that's okay. But if we recognize it and make peace with that fact, that's an important thing. Now, how can we become more flexible in response? That's a good question. The answer is resilience. Resilience isn't just a set of thought processes that you go through, that you go through, and then all of a sudden now, I got it. I'm bendable and flexible when things happen. Well, a cognitive process is not going to get you out of a physical mess. It may give you the strategy, but you still have to have the physical dynamism to make things happen. And within that dynamism, you have to have physical resilience. We want heart rate variability. Many studies have been done, stress science in particular pays a lot of attention to how one conditions to extreme reactivity, where the heart rate spikes and gets up, where there's an emotional load, and often people would be very irritable and angry. And those are very narrowed options whenever we're extremes of stress are pushing us to the point where we feel unsafe. We get reduced down to the fight-flight reaction, to the high vigilance, elevated heart rate, and the change in breathing, the tension in the muscles, the release of the adrenaline, release of cortisol, a spike in the immune system that's really good for you if it just happens once, but not really good if it's a chronic, continuous stress. That's actually corrosive to the body. So the assumption of safety is temporary. That's the take-home message on that. Some things I'd like us to think about. This is going to be a relatively short episode because I just wanted us to touch on that concept, and we'll be touching on others here shortly that are related to this, but also things that'll help us put a system together of coping mechanisms, skills, tools that'll help us better regulate ourselves before the stress happens, be able to predict what's coming down towards us by learning how to trust what our body's telling us, even though maybe the social paradigm or the social cue says, no, don't go, that would be embarrassing, don't walk away, don't let people know that you look or feel nervous. That's not okay. That has to do with social value. Social value can be important when you're a cave person and 10,000 years ago, where you left alone. Your six is not covered. There aren't extra eyes looking around you to help you stay sensitive to the things that you can't see, but you cue on them turning their head, and all of a sudden, hey, now you're safer because you see what they're looking at. Whenever you're no longer there, then social value is important. In our modern times, it's a little different, but our wiring is still very amenable to that sort of feeling sense. Survival reasoning is a very important thing, and that has a lot to do with the assumption of safety. And the bottom line that I was mentioning that we would talk about has to do with why do we always have to measure against the most extreme threat, danger, death? Because this is where we run into what we call our reactivity, our anxiety, and our panic. These are the things that dog our days and make us really uncomfortable that we wish would not take over. And this isn't a podcast about stopping that. Because no, you want it. You want it to take care of you. But we don't want it to drive our lives. Because when we become cynical or insensitive, and we see things as only threat, then we lose a whole lot of living there. A whole lot of color, a whole lot of expressive, good feelings that we can experience. But because we're afraid that it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket in a moment, my assumption of safety is gone, or it's going to be gone. It's still here, but man, it's going to be gone here soon enough. Then we tend to take away some of that flexibility in response, and we tend to stay on and always in protective mode, and we can't enjoy as much as we should. Because we do know our time is limited while we're here. And higher quality of life is good. Higher quantity of quality things is best, especially in relationships. So, we discussed assumption of safety. We'll be covering more along the lines of, well, why does our brain predict the negative? And I'll leave you with this idea. We speak language in metaphorical sense, and most of our language speaks in picture words. What I'm going to ask you, this is not really homework, but a rhetorical question, but also one that's self-directed. So you can work at developing skill. Why is it that whenever I hear words and exaggerations, you're always like this, you're never like that? Or you're such a fill in the blank. Try not to. This is just an exercise once again. That we get honked off, we get upset, we get irritable, we get insulted. Some say, and I would say mistakenly, because they've taken off with the political sense of it, that I would much rather be physically hurt than mentally, emotionally hurt, because those scars last forever. Well, I'm calling BS on that. I would much rather go to a therapist if I had to versus have to mend from a broken leg. I've had broken bones. They really hurt. Those things leave their indelible impressions as well. People assume that you heal. But much of what we hurt from often has to do with how much we believe and how much evidence we seek to support that. So this is the idea I'm leaving you with. What our believer believes, our prover proves. So whenever I believe something or I say something and I don't want to be wrong because I'm human, I want to sound like I'm smart, I'm going to look for evidence to support what it is that I'm saying. Accurate, inaccurate, doesn't matter what the resource is. I'm going to find something to support that. True or not. But it sounds real enough and I have feelings behind it, so that's my evidence. So it must be real because it feels really good or really powerful somehow. What the believer believes, the prover proves. How much of our pain often is self-chosen? Not because I pick it because I want to hurt, but rather because I chose to believe things a certain way versus suspending belief and realizing that often the pain that I have has to do with my interpretations and my beliefs of certain ideas, of certain people's opinions versus direct experience. So we'll stop there for today. And I want to say thank you for spending time with me this evening. And I want to tell you that I hope that your assumption safety is met frequently and that you smile within that and be able to share it with others. And if you get a chance, hey, share this podcast. Let somebody know about it that you think may be able to benefit from it. We're going to have a whole lot more information coming up soon that's going to be very useful and helpful and actionable. And I'm hoping that we have another opportunity to visit. Like, subscribe, share. Take care. Have a good night.